Good afternoon, and I want to thank everyone who was involved in inviting me to speak with you this afternoon. I want to acknowledge the fact before I start my presentation that I'm really going to talk about trends in accreditation in the trace evidence community, and I'll apologize to those who don't live in the United States that these are reflecting trends within the United States. I haven't gathered any data about what might be going on in other countries, and so I want to acknowledge that before I get started. I will also say, just as one point, that I've been sitting in here all day. I just arrived this morning and have been listening all day and have picked up on a couple of the DNA bashing events that have gone on. And I can't join in that. But I will tell you that from an accreditation standpoint, it's become quite easy for me to put together a team to evaluate and inspect a DNA laboratory. What is increasingly more difficult for me to do is to put together a team of technically competent trace evidence examiners. Because of the diversity of what you do, it's a real challenge for an accrediting body to make sure that we're sending a team in that actually has the technical competence to evaluate the many different things we see being done in the trace evidence discipline. So I won't bash DNA, but I will tell you that I find your discipline more complex. The note that you will find when you look at this presentation on your CD says these numbers may not be accurate. I'll tell you that they really are. There's been a very slight change. So when we see later that there are 325 accredited labs, it's really 327. So the numbers aren't significant enough to really be concerned with. Some of you in the room may not know what ASCLD lab is, so let me just stop briefly and say it's the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board. Our purpose and only purpose is to accredit crime laboratories in the United States. And the program has been active since 1982, but it's been active since 1982 in accrediting laboratories in standards that were developed and agreed upon by crime laboratory directors in the United States. In 2004, the ASCLD Lab Delegate Assembly, the governing body of my agency, adopted and implemented an ISO 17025 program of accreditation, and so we have been offering the ISO 17025 accreditation since 2004. But in both of those programs, from the beginning, 1982 in the older program, in 2004, certainly the accreditation of the trace evidence discipline has been a part of both programs since the beginning. Currently, and you can read these numbers for yourself, I'll just highlight a couple points. We do have 325 laboratories currently accredited by ASCLD Lab, and that is in both programs. It does include a small number of laboratories outside the United States, but we're primarily talking about laboratories in the United States. And you can see the breakdown there for yourself of how they stack up in terms of federal, state, local, and other laboratories. And then 36, actually there's 37 now in the ISO program. And what I wanted to share with you is just some trends about what's happened over the last 10 years. These numbers really will reflect the trends in accrediting laboratories in trace evidence over the last 10 years. This first slide shows the total number that's accredited today. And so you see the blue columns show the total numbers in each program, and the purple, I guess it is, color shows of that number how many are accredited in the trace evidence discipline. And so that's the first set of data that you see. And this just combines both programs together and tells you that of the 325 labs we currently have accredited, 181 of those are accredited in some form of the trace evidence discipline. There has been steady growth over the past 10 years. I think it's significant to point out at this point that at least within the United States, accreditation, except for New York, Oklahoma, and Texas, is a voluntary process. So the fact that we see a growing number of labs being accredited in any discipline, I think speaks well for the U.S. forensic science community. But you can see that we've had a steady growth over the last 10 years in the number of laboratories accredited in our program in the trace evidence discipline, with the current number being 181. I plotted out for you also, if we know in 1997 that there were 86 labs, how many new labs do we see being added each year? And so this chart reflects that number for you. I did go back and do some analysis, and really there's no historical or other reason that I can tell you that we see a few spikes in the number of labs being added each year. I guess it's just that those labs were preparing, and that just happens to be the year they got ready to be included in the program. But we see that there are at least some labs being added every year who are performing work in the trace evidence discipline. Now in the ASCLD lab program, and this varies from accrediting body to accrediting body, but in the ASCLD lab program, we have what I call the magic 3. Now nobody else in ASCLD lab will acknowledge that term because I made it up. But what it means is that if you're doing, let's say, hair analysis and fiber analysis, we will come and do an assessment of your laboratory and accredit your laboratory, and your certificate will say trace evidence, but in parentheses it will say hair and fiber. If you add any 1/3 subdiscipline, that parenthetical reference goes away, and your certificate just simply says you're accredited in trace evidence. And you could legally and ethically and morally, I guess, claim in court to be accredited in any area of trace evidence. So I'm going to make a distinction here between our legacy program and the ISO 17025 program, because I think the ISO program does a good job of addressing the problem that I just spoke about, and that's not being specific about what you're accredited in. So in full means that you're doing that magic 3 or more. Your certificate just simply says trace, and you see that's the largest number of labs. So for the largest number of labs accredited in the legacy program, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to tell really what did we look at when we went into that laboratory, what were the technical competencies that we saw in that laboratory. The labs that don't reach that magic 3, you see that list on the bottom of the page, and those are the labs that are just being accredited in very specific areas of trace evidence, and it gives the number there, obviously with fire debris being one of the most popular trace evidence disciplines to fall in that category. Now as we move to the international program, I told you that that magic 3 phenomenon goes away, because in the ISO program we are required, as all ISO accrediting bodies are, to be very specific about what we're accrediting the laboratory in. And so in our program, we refer to what are called categories of testing, and that might equate to the term you may be more familiar with, which is subdisciplines. The ISO program, when you're accredited, you will receive a scope of accreditation document, which will very specifically identify the tests for which you have been accredited, or in our case, the categories of testing. Now that has some implications that I'll get to in just a moment about proficiency testing, particularly subdiscipline proficiency testing, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. But in our ISO program, the international program, we are very clearly identifying what we're accrediting labs in. Now we've only accredited 37 labs, so these numbers are low, but you can see on the slide, I won't read it for you, you can see the different areas and how that breaks down. Of the 37 labs we've accredited, who's doing what. And it continues on to the next slide. And you can see toward the bottom of that list that in some cases it's getting very specific about what that laboratory is doing. And so one of the things we're looking at in our program, where we identify categories of testing, everybody kind of agrees on the core subdisciplines, hair and glass and paint and fire debris. And then we have this category that's generally agreed upon in the community called analysis of unknowns. We're looking at probably identifying another category to kind of catch some of these things that you see appearing at the bottom of this list, that maybe we can lump those into some other category. The reason that's of importance is that there is a new requirement, at least in the ASCLD Lab Legacy program. That's the program that's been around since 1982. That new requirement is that now, over the course of the 5-year accreditation cycle, there is now an absolute essential requirement that every person must be proficiency tested at least once during the 5-year cycle in each subdiscipline in which the examiner performs casework. So it's going to be very important for ASCOD Lab to be very specific about what we mean when we say subdiscipline, and that's some language we're working on. But this probably is of more interest and has more direct impact on the trace evidence discipline than it does in any other area. The full application of that new requirement, it was just adopted by our delegate assembly. And I will tell you that what the board of directors in ASCOD Lab has done to prepare for implementing that new requirement is to go back and look at very clearly defining what are subdisciplines that we recognize in trace evidence. And so our board, I think, is doing a good job, and you can anticipate some language coming out very soon which will identify a core group, and you can guess what they are: glass, fiber, fire debris, paint, hair, those basic core subdisciplines of trace. And the language will say these are the ones we identify. The laboratory may identify others. And so I would encourage you to do that if this program relates to you, that you not ignore that, and that you do take the core group that we give you and then add to that list with whatever you think you're doing in your laboratory. In the international program, we'll spend some time more clearly identifying the distinction between subdiscipline and categories of testing, and we'll publish some language that will hopefully make that clear to everybody who is concerned about that. I will tell you that I've mentioned the fact that we've implemented the ISO 17025 program. There is a trend in this country. There's been a trend around the world for quite some time. It's just kind of catching on in this country in recent years to reach out and embrace these international standards. And that is being done in the United States. And the ISO standard that we informally refer to as 17025 or just to ISO, that you see the formal reference there as to what we're actually talking about when we say that. 17025, I cannot give you a copy of that. Some people like to come to conferences and walk away with nice copies of all these standards. They're copyrighted by ISO, and so I'm not authorized to provide you with a copy of those today, but you can acquire them from a variety of different sources. The American National Standards Institute is probably one of the easiest places to get it, and you see there the contact information for their website. And all around the world, accrediting bodies who use ISO 17025 to accredit laboratories will supplement 17025 with what they're referred to by many different names, but I prefer to call it what it is, and that's a set of supplemental requirements. You have to do 17025, and to be accredited by ASCOD Lab, you must also do this. That's what supplemental requirements are. Those supplemental requirements are available if you're interested. You can contact me for a copy of those. The ASCOD Lab International ISO program, and the reason I chose to be more specific about that, because when you talk about the required use of the standard reference materials that Susan mentioned, or certified reference materials, and then you go on and read the language in ISO about the fact that if there are standard methods available, like Ron talked about, that you should give some preference to those standard methods. That's all a part of the ISO culture, and one that we all need to learn more about and become more familiar with. I think that all of you in the room who are familiar with the legacy accreditation standards that have been around since 1982, I'll tell you that all of those elements remain in place. ISO captures all of those, but ISO goes on into other elements. And this slide basically just reviews for you what some of those are. And there are a couple on there that everybody likes to talk about. And unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about those today. Uncertainty of measurement, traceability reporting requirements there's lots of urban legends out there, I call them, about what ISO requires. I would encourage you to read the standard. Don't listen to your neighbor. Pick up the standard and read the standard. And I think you might be surprised in some cases that what's being spread around the community is really not all that true. In conclusion, I'll tell you that I think the international standards do represent the consensus of the world as opposed to just the opinion of one nation. I think the compliance with the ISO standards will enhance your quality system, or to be true to ISO, I'll call it your management system, which is the right phrase. And I think for those of you in the room who may not be, have not been exposed to the international standards, I'll tell you that I think moving from the standards that you might be complying with today to compliance with the ISO standards is really not all that hard. It's very doable, very manageable for most every crime laboratory of which I know. So that concludes my remarks this afternoon, and I'll turn the podium back over to Sandy for the question period. Thank you.